Welcome, Brookings Bio students. This is Mrs. Rydell, and we are going to start our new chapter, Chapter 11, looking at the work of this gentleman. His name is Gregor Mendel. So you should start reading in your book, start reading Chapter 11, and we're going to talk a little bit about that first section in Chapter 11, which has to do with the idea of passing traits from parents down to their offspring, that transmission of characteristics. How you look, what color of hair, what color eyes you have, how tall you are. That passing of those characteristics from parents to offspring is called heredity. And what this chapter is about is the science that studies that process of how we pass our traits, and it's called genetics. Genetics is the science that studies heredity, how those traits are passed from one generation to the next. If you think about people in your family, you know that a lot of times if you have a family get together, someone will say, oh, you look just like Grandpa Bob, or you look like Aunt Susie. And it's because those characteristics tend to run in families, and kids look like their parents and their grandparents and the people who are in your family. And so that idea of studying how that whole process works is what this chapter is about. So we have to start with this man. His name is Gregor Mendel, and he is considered to be the father of genetics. He was a monk who lived quite a long time ago, and he was really one of the first people to scientifically look at how those traits are passed and really try and understand how the idea of the heredity, and he did experiments, and he was actually the first person to kind of use the scientific method to study traits and how they're passed. He didn't know about genes at that time. We hadn't discovered genes, but he could see that traits were passed from one generation to the next. And he was one of the first people to actually do experiments to try and understand that. And that's why he's considered to be the father of genetics. And what he did, his job as a monk in the monastery was to work in the garden. So he spent a lot of time outside. He spent a lot of time growing plants. And so he kind of got interested in looking at traits and how they pass from one generation to the next. And he started doing little experiments. And the experiments that he is famous for is experimenting with pea plants. And so what he did was to take pea plants and actually do genetic crosses to see if I cross this plant that looks a certain way, a certain color flower, certain size, with another kind of plant that looks different, what kind of offspring am I going to get? And so what he did was to experiment and set up experiments using the flowers of the pea plants. And if we think about flower structure, flowers are really the reproductive organs of plants. They have a male part that makes the sperm, that's pollen. When we think about, talk about hay fever, or you're allergic to pollen, what's inside the pollen is really the plant sperm, and is blowing in the wind or being carried to the female part of a flower. In the center here, the female part is making the egg cell. Plants do sexual reproduction, just like we don't think about plants doing sex. We think about animals doing sex, but plants also have a reproductive female part and a male part of the plant, and they make eggs and sperm. And so what he was doing was picking particular plants and making genetic crosses and seeing what happened. The interesting thing about peas is they normally pollinate themselves. We call them self-pollinating. So the male sperm of one flower actually pollinates the same flower, the same plant. And so seeds from pea plants really, technically, even though we're making eggs and sperm, really only have one parent. If you self-pollinate, you're pollinating yourself. And so easy to do experiments with that kind of organism. And so what he started doing was to design experiments to try and figure out how some of these traits were being passed that he saw in his peas. So what he would do was to pick what we call true breeding plants that always consistently have this show that same characteristic over and over and over, multiple generations. So if you cross this plant with itself, self-pollinate, it always makes offspring that look identical to themselves. So red flowers, and I cross them with red flowers, and I get red flowered offspring, and if I cross those, I get red flowered offspring. We call those true breeding organisms. That trait shows up over and over and over again. So what he did was take plants and remove the pollen making part from the flowers, and then he was able then to add his own pollen from the plants that he was wanting to cross. So he would, instead of letting the plant self-fertilize and fertilize itself, he went in with little scissors and he would snip off the pollen making part of the flower, and then he could add pollen from a different flower to make a genetic cross, and then look to see what kind of offspring you could get. So it allowed him to what we call crossbreed, mix DNA from different looking plants and see what happened, to study the results. And the reason he's so famous is not that he just made the crosses, but he kept very careful records of which kind of plants were crossing with which kind of plants, how many seeds he got, and he was very meticulous about writing everything down. So if he looked at characteristics in plants, we would call them traits. He was looking at things like what color seeds the peas had, or what shape the seeds were. What did the pods look like? Where were the flowers on the plant? Were they tall plants, short plants? He looked at lots of different traits. In fact, he looked at 7 traits in peas, and they had to do with shapes and colors and sizes. And so he was making crosses between different looking plants to see what would happen. Think about, can we translate that into humans? What would be an example of a trait that you could see in people? Just like seeds in plants, we have different colors. Skin color, hair color, eye color would be traits. Tallness, intelligence, how big your nose is. All of those are traits. They're characteristics that you can see. And so what Mendel did in his experiment is he would pick 2 very different looking true breeding plants, and ones that always made red flowers, ones that always made white flowers, and he would make a cross. He would take the pollen from one and put it on the flowers of the other plant. And he called that first generation, the first plants that he crossed, the P1 generation. So crossing, for example, red flowers, a pea that had red flowers with a plant that had white flowers. P stands for parent, parental. That's the parental generation. And he would make the cross, put the pollen on the flower, and then watch to see what happened. The flower would be fertilized, and you'd get seeds, and then he'd plant the seeds that grew and see what happened. And then he'd count the offspring. And so the offspring that he got from that first generation cross, he called the F1 generation. F stands for filial. Your filial generation is your offspring. The very first offspring is called the F1 generation. And then what he would do is take those plants that came from the first cross, and he would cross them with each other. So plants from the F1 generation, if you cross them with other F1 plants, and then look to see what kind of offspring you get. So the second generation of offspring, he called F2. So think about that in terms of you, in terms of people. If F2 is you, F2 is your generation, who would the F1 generation be? Who would be your, think about going back a generation now. If this is you, your generation, the F1s would be your parents, right? And the F2, or the P1s, would be their parents, your grandparents, right? And so we're looking at generation after generation after generation. What are the offspring going to look like? So here's the cross. I'm going to take 2 very different looking plants, for example, a tall plant and a short plant, and I make the cross, pollinate from one flower to the other, and then I look to see what happened, what kind of offspring I get. And the offspring that grow, I'm going to pollinate these with each other and then look to see what the next generation is going to look like. And he kept very careful records about who he was crossing with whom and what did the offspring look like. And this is the pattern that he saw every single time. If he crossed two very different looking plants, tall with short, yellow seeds, green seeds, wrinkly seeds, smooth seeds, green pods, yellow pods, he was picking different traits and crossing them. What he always saw was in the first generation, the F1s, the first generation of offspring, all of the offspring produced always looked the same. They always were the same. They looked like one of the parents, not both though. So in this case, if I cross a tall plant with a short plant, all I get is tall offspring. If I cross these together though, and I look at the next generation, what I see is a combination. Some of the offspring look like the tall parent, and some of the offspring look like the short back here, the grandparent. That little trait that disappeared here comes back again in the F2 generation. So that same pattern showed up over and over and over again. When Mendel crossed two pure plants, two pure breeding plants with two contrasting traits, tall with short, yellow with green, wrinkly with round, he always found the same pattern. Only one trait showed in the F1 generation. But if you crossed those organisms, the missing trait came back again in the F2. And it always came back in the same ratio, 3 to 1. 3 talls, 1 short. And that same pattern showed up over and over and over again. And it didn't really matter what trait he was looking for. He saw that same pattern again and again. And remember I said genetics is all about patterns. So patterns are the key. If you cross a purple flowered pea plant with a white flowered pea plant, first generation of offspring, the F1s all are purple. You don't see any whites. It's missing. Only purple flowers show up. But if I cross these guys, I get some purples, and that white color comes back again in some of the offspring. Always 3 to 1 ratio. If I cross wrinkly seeds, wrinkly seeds with round seeds, round smooth seeds, I always get first generation of offspring, the F1s all smooth, no wrinkles. But when I cross these guys together in that next generation, some wrinkly ones come back again. That missing trait that's hiding here shows up in the grandkids. Some smooth, some wrinkly, always 3 to 1 ratio. So what Mendel decided was, looking at the results of his experiment, that there must be a pair, he called them factors, that determine or control each of the traits. And that one factor must be able to hide the other one. Because if I look at these plants, right, and the wrinklies don't show, but it comes back again in this next generation, the thing that's controlling that trait has to be there. It has to be hiding somehow, and then shows up again later on. And so what Mendel thought about was the traits, what's controlling the traits have to come in pairs, and that one of those factors has to be able to hide. Remember, he didn't know about genes, and he called them factors. So if you think about, connect to something that we already know now. We now know that what Mendel was calling those factors are really genes, and they're carried on homologous chromosomes. Remember, he said pairs, they come in pairs. Homologous partners are pairs of chromosomes. One came from mom, one came from dad, right? And so if you have two kinds of chromosomes, and one is carrying the gene, for example, for tallness, and one is carrying the gene for shortness, right? One of those traits, one of those genes has to be able to hide the other one. They come in pairs. And so what we're looking at, what he was really looking at, was what was going on with genes on chromosomes. Vocab word, the different choices that you have for a trait are called alleles. Think green eyes, brown eyes, blue eyes. Tall, short, wrinkly seeds, round seeds, yellow seeds, green seeds. Those are all choices for a trait, and those choices are called alleles. So when we talk about alleles, the allele that can dominate, that can hide the presence of another allele if it's there, is called the dominant allele. And the recessive allele is the one that can be hidden. Even though it's there, we don't see it. Okay? So when we look at dominant and recessive gene choices, dominant and recessive alleles, why does the one trait disappear here in the F1 generation and then come back again? The gene for it is here, but it's hiding, right? That pattern that we see corresponds to what the chromosomes are doing during meiosis, connects to our meiosis chapter. Remember when we talked about meiosis and making sperms and eggs, right? When we were talking about making sperm cells, taking our starting parent cell, dividing and then dividing again to get sperms, or doing that meiosis in ovaries to make egg cells, right? What the chromosomes were doing, homologous chromosomes were doing during anaphase 1, meiosis, remember, segregation, split up the partners, right? Has to do with how those traits show up when we're looking at F1 and F2 offspring, right? If this is the gene for tallness and this is the gene for shortness, right? When that parent cell does meiosis to make sperms or eggs, each of those allele choices is going to end up in a different sperm or egg. So F1 offspring, if I'm a tall parent who has both a tall and a short gene, the parent is going to show tallness, right? Even if the other gene choice is there. So if you are crossing a tall plant, for example, that has all tall genes, with a short plant that has all short genes, the F1 plants all have, they're going to look tall, but they're carrying that little gene for shortness, that little allele choice. Remember, you have two of everything. So if you get a tall gene and a short gene, the tall one is going to show. And that has to do with making sperms and eggs, right? How we get those alleles together to make the seed, to make the baby, right? The law of segregation says that those alleles are going to be separated when the F1 plants make their gametes. So in that F1 generation that looks tall, it still is carrying those little alleles for shortness. And when they make sperms and eggs, they can pass that little short allele on to some of their sperm and egg cells. And if those short genes get together, those short allele choices get together, you could get a plant in your F2 generation that shows the short trait, even though none of these guys looked short. When those gametes combine in the F2 generation, that recessive trait comes back again. And it always comes back in a quarter of the offspring, 3 talls to 1 short. That's the end of section number 1. Stay tuned for more about genetics.